Good morning. It's like Alumni Day, right? Lots of folks I haven't seen in a long time. It's good to see you. My name is Mark Winston-Griffith, and I, just so you know why I'm here, why I'm standing here, why I'm talking to you, I am the Executive Director of the Drum Major Institute for Public Policy, which is a progressive think tank based in New York. And prior to that, I was the co-director of an organization called the Neighborhood Economic Development Advocacy Project, which is located in New York as well. We use that term communities of color so easily, so comfortably, but obviously there's a big question is what does that all mean? And it's complex, and I think we're going to get into the complexity here in this conversation. We have folks who are from different organizations across the country, and I hope it doesn't feel like we've tried to sort of peg people and capture the whole rainbow as it is. You know, we've got you see the way things have been lined up here, right? So I hope we're not too self-conscious in us trying to be representative of the entire communities of color spectrum, but I think there has been some effort to do a little bit of that. So let me engage. Do I have an hour and a half still, Lou?
You have an hour and 15 minutes.
Okay, I've been talking for 15 minutes, have I? Sorry. All right. So I want to sort of get into a threshold question, and first let me just ask folks if you could just. Let me just tell you this. This is the first time we've been talking, right? So I think that folks may be a little, I won't say nervous, but a little bit apprehensive about what's about to occur. But what I'm going to ask is if everyone could just say for a moment who they are and why their sort of background is relevant to this conversation that we're having today.
Do we start down at this
Yes,
end?
start on that side. Work your way down.
I'm Rebecca Adamson with First Peoples Worldwide, and I guess I go back with asset-based development way before maybe even Melvin at the Ford Foundation when Frank Thomas was president. And I think Melvin, do you remember your predecessor? It was Norm Weaver, I think, and he used to, out of frustration, kind of roll his eyes and say, "What is it you do, Rebecca?" And because he was like small business creation, job training, microfinance, and really what it was asset-based development, and we didn't have a name for it. And this was like 1980. We worked in Indian country, and all we knew was that the Bureau of Indian Affairs controlled our assets, and that was the main problem. And so from 1980, we really had worked with strategies around how we as Indian people could control our assets. And since then, we've been working globally with the issue of indigenous people. We're 5% of the world's population, and we have 24% of the land on the planet. The Earth's surface is owned by indigenous people, with 80% of the remaining biodiversity on our territories. So we should be the richest people in the world if you think of our statistics, and yet we're the poorest people. And what we've been looking at globally now is what we're calling an asset protection production fund. And we're looking at the fact that as climate change is destroying the assets of poor people, and what's unfolding with like the carbon offset, and now they're looking at biodiversity offset funds. We think there should be an asset offset fund for poor people. So we think it's extremely relevant what's happening now, and that's why we're here. And it feels great to be back with you guys doing asset work. So
that's great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Hasegawa, and I'm with the National Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development. I've been the director for about 8 years, but prior to that, I was the community liaison for the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So I think all of my friends back in California on the West Coast think I'm the DC girl, but my own self-identity still is the local organizer, the community health worker, and that's where I started my career doing public health work. In terms of housing, community development, and the asset building work, I stand on the shoulders of our founding member organizations who have been doing this work in low-income Asian American and Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian communities for over 30 years. They come from the civil rights movement. Our community, as you know, has evolved and diversified over time. As we started out in the 1800s, my family included, mostly East Asian, it has grown in much diversity, and the Census Bureau and other federal policy have put us together as allies with Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians. So we span, and then in the middle there's a lot of refugees and immigrants who've also come to add to the mix of diversity of what is now Asian American and Pacific Islander. I have to say that in prep for this call and this conference, we were told to really focus more on the assets side as opposed to the needs side. I'll talk more about it later, but I think that my struggle always has been in ensuring that the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities that are in poverty, our community is very bipolar, if you will. We have those who are very wealthy and those who are very, very poor. And their statistics, when you disaggregate it, they hone much more towards what you would expect traditionally with other communities of color in low-income neighborhoods, and we're always fighting the model minority myth. And so I think that the challenge is that how do we figure out focusing on those who are so invisible within the community of color context, within our own communities, and within federal government policy, and then still have this sort of asset-based frame, because so often we don't say low income in our name, and so many financial institutions come to us think that we're going to give them access to the very wealthy Asian American and Pacific Islander community, and I'm like, that's not who we are. So it'll be interesting to be here. Again, I stand on the shoulders of folks who have been doing work not only in Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, but in a very multi-ethnic way. So it's very exciting to be here with all of you. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Mike Soto. I'm from San Juan, Puerto Rico. I work with the Center for the New Economy. How am I relevant to this is the question. We've been working in the asset field for a while, and it's interesting because as I was thinking about what to say, and I'm not apprehensive by the fact that we haven't talked. I'm just not sure at all about what we're supposed to do. So those are two different things.
Same thing.
But as I thought about it, you know, it's interesting. When we started working 10 years ago with things like IDAs and children's savings accounts, we had such a hard time selling these ideas to people. Mm-hmm. It was difficult to get them to understand the difference between income and wealth. And we had so many problems trying to convince them to put their money away, to save. And now, it's very interesting because now nobody believes in savings anymore. Savings has seemed to change completely as a concept. Housing, which was the other area where we would focus a lot on, is completely different as well as when we started 10 years ago. So I thought it was great that this panel was called Seismic Shifts, because it really does seem like we are in a completely different place than we had been, and the issues and the obstacles and the problems that we had to deal with before are completely different now. This is not serious, but I think it's very interesting. I remember I always liked how Chris Rock referred to this. He said, you know, the difference between income and wealth is, you know, Shaquille O'Neal, Shaq is rich, but the guy who signs Shaq's checks, that guy's wealthy. Well, the interesting thing is now, Rob Sarver, the guy who signs those checks, is worth like 3/4 less than he was just a year ago. So things are different for everybody now. The landscape is completely different. And I think we have a fantastic opportunity, as a lot of this is being remade and redone, to take part of that and to make sure that a lot of the people that were left out the first time some of these regulations and some of this system was put together to make sure that those people are in the system this time.
My name is John Powell. I'm the founder and director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. And also I founded the Institute on Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota. I've been involved in various aspects of this work for years, and I'll just mention a couple of things that are current and some things that are going back a little bit. I did a major study with Roger and Insight, before it was Insight, on economic development, focusing particularly on Cleveland, but then the work is spread out. Just as a footnote, just got an email the other day that a lot of things that we had recommended in our Cleveland work is being implemented in Cleveland. From creating incubator funds for minority businesses, to creating regional schools, to regional tax base sharing, and some other things. Also, we have developed a frame that I'll come back to later, which is basically looking at opportunity structures and looking at the physical as well as the social aspect of opportunity and what that has to do with well-being and wealth creation. And I think it's quite a powerful frame, and I'll say more about that later. Also on our website right now, we're tracking the stimulus. We're tracking various aspects of the stimulus, and we're trying to enhance that, trying to do some work with Melvin around that, because I do think there's not only been a cosmic shift, but there's opportunity to change a set of relationships. And unless we do things, this opportunity will be lost. So the cosmic shift doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to, when the dust settles, we're going to be in a better place than where we were when the shift started. And then the last thing I'll just mention now and talk more about later, Roger asked me specifically to talk about a paper I wrote, which you can get online. It's called, it's titled Post-Racialism or Targeted Universalism. And I'm particularly going to focus on the issue of targeted universalism, which is basically looking at why universal strategies don't work by themselves, and yet we want to support universal strategies, but they need to be targeted. They need to be look at the particularities of different groups, and that's geographic groups like people in rural areas or Indian country, as well as different populations like people living in concentrated poverty. So I'll say more about that, but if you have interest, you can go online and look it up also.
Thank you. I actually had quite a few questions, but I've been informed that we don't have a whole lot of time, so we're going to go, the format's going to be, I'm just going to ask some questions. We're just going to kick it for a little while, and then I'm going to turn it over to, well, I'm going to look out here and ask if people have questions for the folks here, and we can, the conversation can then extend out into the room. So let me just start with, I guess, a threshold question. For many of us who've been fighting for economic justice for years and addressing the racial wealth gap, I'm sure we were all relieved to discover that now we're living in a post-racial society. Seriously, I mean, we all know that we will probably never hear President Obama talk about the racial wealth gap, right, explicitly. So how easy or difficult do you think it will be to talk explicitly about economic security for communities of color? And to what extent do you think that will be necessary?
I've been doing some work with some aspect of the administration. I've looked at a number of documents that have already been produced, a number of plans, and it's uneven, but I can say for the most part, most of the plans that are coming out of the administration really, from my perspective, and I recommend my paper for more extensive discussion of this, are post-racial in two ways. One, and I distinguish between post-racial and colorblind. I say colorblind are the conservatives who basically are hostile to any kind of thing of trying to change the conditions of minoritized people. And I use the term minoritized as opposed to minority because it speaks to power and a process. The post-racial group is more liberal, and they really want to change conditions, but they believe that the work of race can be done through other things, like class. And so they believe they can develop some other axis to do all the work of race. And when you look at it empirically, which I've done some in this paper, it just doesn't work. And so what you see coming out in terms of policies are policies that are designed to hopefully reach communities of color without talking about communities of color. And again, for the most part, they will not work. One interesting thing, one of the major proponents of this position, and a darling of the administration, and really a brilliant scholar, is William Julius Wilson. 12 years ago, 15 years ago, he wrote a book called Declining Significance of Race. He created a big storm, and he's been pushing for universal strategies that don't talk about race ever since then. We've done some email back and forth. He just has a new book out called More Than Race, and he says, I was wrong. He's changed his position, and now he really believes that it's not only necessary to talk about race, but he adopts something which is very akin to what I call targeted universalism.
Thank you. Does anyone else? I mean, you don't have to answer it.
Well, I'll just say something that I think is interesting. I guess I'm not wearing necessarily my API hat, but more as a community person, and sort of what the opportunity is with this new administration and how different the work is now than it was, say, 6 months ago or even 2 years ago. I think that one of the challenges that I personally feel like we're struggling with every day is that the task now is not to come up with the laundry list of wishes and critiques, but the task now is to figure out not only how to we have to. I was having conversation because so we have to actually come up with what the solutions are, and we can't just ask the questions anymore. And so while I thought I had a lot of really good solutions, when I'm given the task of actually writing a speech for someone or writing up what those solutions and what those policy initiatives might look like, it's a very different exercise. And working closely with those in the White House who worked on the campaign, who are now in the administration, in federal agencies, at the White House, the exercise is very, very different. And so I think that the challenge here today is, again, melding all of the great work of community-based organizations, all of the innovation, and figuring out how do we roll those initiatives and that creativity up into these national initiatives. And I think I'm really glad we're going to be talking about messaging, because I think that so much of it actually is going to be around the messaging as well.
Let's put our sort of political reality hats on for a moment. Again, I think that to the extent that President Obama offers opportunities for us, I think that because he is a black man, there are actually some limitations he has around the conversation around race. I guess my question is: will we have to be explicit? Is that the term? Is that what is necessary for us to get across, to deliver the policies that we feel need to be put in place? Or are there other ways through that? For instance, the president has started a task force, a middle-class task force that is being headed by Vice President Biden. Is there a conversation that is possible there around the emerging middle class, that is about poor people and about people having access to affordable health care and affordable housing and well-paying jobs, that actually is a conversation about race? Is there something that could be done within the Office of Urban Affairs and Policy, for instance? And when we talk about urban issues, we're talking about people of color. So is there a way to have that conversation? And I don't want to be perceived as trying to run away from what we should be saying, but in terms of what is going to be strategically most effective, are there some savvy ways to have a conversation about race without being explicit about it, or not?
Well, I'm leaving early because I'm going over to the urban policy over to White House this afternoon to talk to them about some of these things. The thing is, and it's a very good question, and it really deserves much more attention than what we can give it. The way we talk about race right now is this. We talk about race in a very sort of as they say, 1960s, 1970s civil rights frame, or we believe the alternative is in this post-racial frame. Both of those are problematic. And to sort of think about why after 20 years or 30 years of research will William Jewis Wilson come out and say, I was wrong? It's an empirical question. It's not an ideological question. And the thing is, it's not, do we talk about race? It's how do we talk about race? There's really great research that's coming out that I'm on the periphery of in terms of implicit bias. Americans think about race and process race in phenomenal ways. The work of Larry Bobo. And so, but the conversation that we need to have about race is not necessarily the same conversation that we had in the 1960s and 1970s. It's a much more sophisticated conversation. And it's a conversation that links people up. The difficulty in terms of trying to figure out some alternative, whether it's urban or whether it's class to do with race, is that we all occupy multiple spaces. Let me just give you a couple of concrete examples. A poor white is, a poor African American is 6 or 7 times more likely to live in concentrated poverty than a poor white person. If you just look at income, it looks like they're similarly situated. They're not similarly situated. There's a new study that's come out from the Harvard School of Sociology. They look at 4 or 5 indicators of high distress, of areas of high distress. And they say if you live in this high distress environment, within the first 3 years, 4 years of school, you lose 6 IQ points and the equivalent of 1 grade, and it takes a lifetime to make it up. Interesting. Who is in these 6 factors? Who is at the intersection of these 6 factors? 97% of the population that live at these intersections are African Americans. And what I'm saying is that could you sort of look at multiple factors, which we do all the time, to actually describe the conditions of blacks or Native Americans or Latinos? Yes. But the implicit bias stuff also says, in terms of policy, and this is I guess the rub, we really have to look at the work that our multiple policies are doing, that there's a sensitivity among the larger community about policy issues. So for example, take vouchers. The thing that killed the voucher program under Clinton was when vouchers by African Americans were taking them and going to white communities, and literally people were saying, what are these people doing showing up in our communities? And they killed the program, essentially. So it's, as a theoretical question, yes, you could do a lot around race without talking about it. Empirically, it's very hard, and people are very sensitive to it. So when you say welfare queen, people know you're talking about race. When you talk about inner city, people know you're talking about race. When you talk about criminal justice, people think you're talking about race. But it's at that point, not a productive conversation. So we need to figure out how to have a productive conversation that Obama sort of hearkened to in his Philadelphia speech. At the end of the day, though, we need to really look at the work that our policies are doing. It's not just a conversation, the work that our policies are doing, and are they reducing the racial gap in wealth and other things. And so we really need to be extremely sensitive in the design and in the evaluation of policies to see what they're doing, which means one thing, we have to keep data. We have to really keep the data to know, and right now, there's a lot of data that's not even being kept at the federal level.
Thank you.
I think this point about data is very important. One of the things that I think is going to be increasingly important is measuring and monitoring what's happening, particularly with our communities. I know for Puerto Rico in particular, we fall through the cracks a lot of times, and so a lot of the work that we've had to do at the center is actually do our own surveys and our own research so that we have data. It's very difficult to keep up with any of this if you don't have the monitoring or the measurement to know what's happening. And I think it's interesting. I hadn't thought about 2 things before I came up here. One is Linda's point on the global aspect of this. I think you're completely right. I had not thought about the implications of that, and I think it might be interesting to actually discuss that a little further. But the other thing is yes, there is this sense of everything is different now, and there's a black precedent, and there are all these great opportunities. But as I think about it, we are still living in the same world. I think it's important not to forget that. I don't think anything changes overnight. I don't think we should assume that institutions are different from one day to the next. I think we need to still be very much vigilant about what's happening and not forget what we're doing here and think that things are all of a sudden different and better. I think great opportunities are out there, but the truth is, I think we still live in the very similar world to the one that we lived in last year.
I'll just really quickly say that I think that there is an opportunity for us to do some organizing on the advocacy side in terms of the grassroots groups, organizations locally to come together in a more multiracial format. Maybe, and again, the messaging, our intent, and maybe our discussion with each other is very explicit around eliminating disparities, but the work that we do is messaged in a different way, but at least the ideas are firmly connected with the goals of that the advocacy groups have had for a really long time. And so I guess for me, it's really about also the who is at those tables with those policy recommendations. And my hope about the effectiveness is whether or not a lot of the advocacy groups that are connected to grassroots and community organizations are part of that. But I think that there's a lot of work to do on our end too, not just on their end, and that's sort of where I would say we need to spend some time focusing too.
Thank you. You don't have to respond, Rebecca.
Yeah, no.
Okay. All right. We really don't have much more time for us, but I do kind of want to inject something real quick, if possible, before we open it up to everyone else. And that is, I think, one of the most obvious things. That is, we've seen a huge transfer of wealth over the past year. In the last quarter, I think that we saw a drop of 5.1 trillion in household wealth, which is the largest drop since they began actually recording this information. And, you know, as we know, the foreclosure crisis has been at the center of this. So what does this foreclosure crisis and this drop in wealth, how do we internalize that and deal with that as far as the asset building conversation and the fact that so many of us have been a part of sort of promoting home ownership and have been talking about home ownership as a way of entering into the American dream? Were there any problems with that? And going forward, you know, what is the message what do we try to promote going forward? How do we regard home ownership going forward? How do we regard asset building going forward? I mean, we're being pushed to consume and spend now in order to get ourselves out of the recession. At the same time, you know, we're actually starting to see savings rates start to creep up a little bit. So, you know, isn't that a good thing? How do we make sense of all that going forward?
Well, again,
Can we start on
sure.
that side of the room?
Well, see, again, I was asked to be the global, so I can only speak from what we're doing is we're now working with the World Bank and the private sector to create an asset protection production fund, and we're working with the emitter countries and companies to set an asset offset fund up. We worked with the earlier with the financial sector to create community notes, and we have $25.8 billion now flowing through the private sector into CDFI funds. $165 million of that is an overseas flow of funds right now that are going into like microfinance, et cetera. And what we thought we could do now by looking at an asset protection production fund is working with the World Bank. We can determine what an asset household portfolio would look like for low-income households and calculate basically what a low-income household asset portfolio would look like. We can determine investment attributes on this fund, and by mapping sort of the four sectors like social entrepreneurs, the CDFI sector, community foundations, and sort of the development sector, we could probably look at the doable deal flows. And we're now trying to then look at how we would approach the emitter countries and capitalize the fund. I mean, we are really trying to look at how we can begin to replace the losses that are going to occur at the low income level due to climate change. We just really think that we got to get away from this mindset of poor people always being victims, and we've got to get away from externalizing what happens to people of color and calling it charity, when in fact it's an economic occurrence. And what's happening is our assets are getting devalued and lost, and it's being written off and not being folded back into the economy. So we're trying to really kind of get a handle on that, but and we're not dealing with it on a home ownership basis, but on an asset loss basis. So, I mean, but there's not the political will in any country, and there's not the political will globally. And what the best work that's being done right now is right here among you guys. The best and the most advanced work, and from here going over to Europe is probably the next step. And so we're trying to make a case. Most of the work has been financial policy, but we're getting it into the natural resource base at this point. And we're trying to make the case that these are legitimate assets, and once they're lost, they have real value, and that they should be compensated and made whole. And so it's an extenuation and an expansion of the market and the sophistication of the real work that you all have been doing. And it needs the political will, and it needs the sophistication and the drive and the strength behind what you all are doing. And we need to stay together, and that's my speech. We got to stay together.
Okay.
Because home ownership is a piece of it, but it just expands.
Sure.
And there's people that just a plot of land is a starting point, a toehold.
We just have time for one more person, and I know, John, you're chomping at the bit. We'll get to you as the audience comes into the conversation. I'll make sure that you're given a chance to answer the question. But Lisa, did you want to chime in?
I was just going to say, in terms of, I think that the comprehensiveness of the approach is really important. In terms of the service delivery system and the work on the ground, many organizations were really targeted and micro-focused on those who didn't have enough assets to become homeowners, right? So we as a national organization even struggled about how much we were going to get into the home ownership work, and then even struggled to figure out whether we were going to then get into the work of the foreclosure prevention, because the folks who were facing foreclosure were oftentimes not those that were traditionally being served by our network of organizations. So I think that in terms of the approach now on a federal level, we have to look at things more comprehensively and figure that piece out.
Give me 30 seconds. I wouldn't be an advocate if I didn't push for my time. I don't think that we need to be very careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater on a lot of these issues. What happened with foreclosures, what happened with a lot of these structures. I'm hearing people now saying, you see, home ownership is wrong. It's not that important. It's not for everybody. I don't think that's true. I think we need to be very careful about what happened, and that's why I think we need to be present in the group when the new regulations and the new framework is set up. I think we need to, and I'll end with this, we need to continue to monitor, to measure, and then we also need to educate and to advocate. I think if we did nothing else, those are the 4 areas that we need to be continually vigilant of.
John, can you get 45 seconds?
Sure. First of all, these are global problems, all of them.
Yes.
The foreclosure problem is not really a foreclosure problem. It's a credit problem. And we are not paying attention to the credit problem. We have a dual credit system going back to the 1930s when the United States created the white middle class and left out everybody else. The credit problem was there, and the way the black and Latino communities were being brought into this was through subprime and predatory loans. It was not the right instruments. The problem is we're going back to a system where we're going to still have a dual credit system. And I'll just end with this. What's wrong with the dual credit system? And I explained this to my daughter. It's like if half society is bartering and the other half society is using money, the society that's bartering will never catch up. Because bartering is much less efficient than using money. Today, money and credit has the same relationship. And for many communities of color, we are not in a credit system. We need to make sure that Treasury, not HUD, Treasury, think about how do you actually bring people of color effectively into a credit system and the right regulations and the right products. That's not the conversation we're having. The products that was pushed into the black and Latino community for subprime were the wrong products and the wrong system.
I'd just like to hear briefly from the panelists as to what would be your #1 priority that you would like to see get done soon, whether it's policy or community-driven or market-driven approach.
Very, very quick answers, please, from all of you, to the extent that you have, you're volunteering an answer.
Well, I can start then. I mean, I'd like to see more market-driven approaches because I feel like policy, well, I think we need some regulations in the market, but I feel like market has potential for more sustainable funding in an asset approach. And so I favor a more market-based solutions.
I think that there should be a group that focuses specifically on CRA and expands it into small business lending and make sure that all of the data is disaggregatable for us by Asian and Pacific Islander population.
I think we need to do two things, and I mentioned them before. I think we need to do more research, measure, and monitor what's going on. And then I think you need to take that and to educate policymakers and advocate. So I think we need to do both of those.
The market's being redone right now. There's an article by Emeritus Sen talking about the redoing of capitalism. And the question is, it'll be done based on policy. So I guess I reject that there's a market and there's policy. The policy actually structures the market. And it's structured in such a way right now that we'll never catch up. And I think if we're going to catch up, we have to be involved in designing policies, market, and instruments that's designed to help us catch up. And I would be very hard-nosed about that. And right now, that's not on the table at all. And even the homeowner thing is never going to catch us up. We pay segregation tax on our home. I mean, so if we want to catch up, and we sort of look at how wealth was created in the white community, there's nothing like that in communities of color right now. And so I don't think it's that hard to actually come up with policies to actually decrease the wealth gap. But that has to be our goal. It's not just looking at, do we do this, do we do IDAs or whatever. And you have to evaluate them. Are they actually going to deliver in terms of reducing the gap? And for the most part, the answer is no.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Nandini Kuti. My question is for John Powell. I want to say that I always learn so much whenever I'm in the presence of Professor Powell. And I can see how the term minoritized people is exactly the right term for what this group is looking at. And I'm personally going to make that switch whenever I use the term. And I was very pleased to know that the Kirwan Institute is tracking the economic stimulus package. Can you tell us briefly what you have found so far with that?
Yeah, right now we're tracking at the federal level. We're going to probably do 6 states. And right now, at best, it's being done per capita, which we think is the wrong way. It's not targeted. For example, if you look at foreclosures in communities of color tend to be concentrated. And so they actually exaggerate the effect of foreclosure. And if you just count the foreclosures, you don't get the real impact. And so we're trying to say to the administration, you need to look at the effect on communities, not just on individuals. Right now, a lot of the monies are going out and is going to states, and states have a lot of discretion. So our second tier is to try to get states to actually do targeted programs. And Ohio is one state, because that's where we are. We'll probably do Michigan, Colorado, Florida. But we think everybody should be doing this. And there's not really necessarily resistance, but it's just not an understanding. For example, we met with the legislature in Ohio. They said, can we target minorities? Isn't that against the law? And the answer is no. So we have the ACLU actually doing a memo right now. We prefer for it to come from the Attorney General's office to say it's still legal to target groups. You can target rural groups. You can target women. But they're not doing it. I mean, it's not that they are resistant. They just don't know. And so part of it is to really see how this money, the effects of this money, not what's going in, but how it's coming out. So we'd invite you to come to our website, but also to participate. We're trying to get more and more groups to really track the money, and not just at individual level, but in terms of neighborhoods and in terms of communities and in terms of need.
We're currently, there is a lot of talk about big investment currently in through progressive group all around. In terms, we're in the same time, do we need a transformative presidency, GI Bill type of, education investment, work for investment. This is what have created the middle class in the past, and actually help people to get out of poverty. Do you have any comments? We already saw definite clear mistake that was done in the past. But as we look at the administration, thinking about these policies in the urban, in the middle class commission and the others, do you have any forethought of what advocacy group, policy groups, and others should be looking at when these investments are put into place? So we create a representative middle class. So we create a representative middle class.
I want to know the answer to that question, too.
I may not be answering your question completely, but I think the framework should be pragmatism. I think we need to be very pragmatic about the kinds of policies and investments that we make. In this article that he talked about, Amartya Sen, he's asking, do we need a new capitalism? And what he ends up saying is, we just need to really relook at different institutions. We don't need, to sort of pigeonhole ourselves into one thing or another. Let's be pragmatic, look at different institutions, see what works. So I think, to sort of answer your question in a broad sense, we need to look at what works and be pragmatic and not necessarily shift to one side or the other.
I would just say that, and again, I'm not just to keep plugging my paper, I actually talk about a lot of that in my paper, and I talk about what went wrong in the New Deal and how to do it right today. And I just say that because I don't have time to go into it in great details. But there are a couple of things we could do. I mean, first of all, you have to look at these things together. You have to look at how these systems interact together and be really hard-nosed about outcomes. And so you could say to agencies that at the end of the day, you'll be evaluated by these outcomes. I was talking to Roger last night, and I was saying, for example, in terms of set-asides or in terms of women in quote-unquote minority businesses, oftentimes we'll give the money to Enron and say, okay, go out and find a couple of women and a couple of minorities to give peanuts to, but you're the big boys. Why don't we reverse that? Why don't we say we're going to actually let these businesses and these procurements to women and people of color, and they go out and find others. So we change the whole power relationship. Yeah. If you have schools where we know one of the big things is the quality of teachers. So we say, okay, the best teachers will go to the students that need them the most. There are a lot of things we could do once we get to specifics, but the real thing is to say at the end of the day, we want policies and procedures, yes, to be pragmatic, where this gap declines. And it has declined in education at particular times, has not declined much in terms of wealth. But we could do it. I mean, it's not, as they say, rocket science.
Lisa, do you have a comment? No?
I can't wait to read his paper.
Okay. Rebecca, you good? Okay. It's not 10:15 yet, so do we have... Oh, come on. Right, the enforcer, right? Okay. Well, we actually do have 8 minutes left, supposedly. Just want to put that in. I know we don't. I'm just throwing it out there. Easy. I want to thank everyone for answering the questions under such tight time constraints, and thank you all for your questions. And we'll just turn it over to you, Lou. Huh? And everyone, thank you.